first of all, in my first slide, the state of the world economy, the huge poverty and inequality that exists around the world, with the richest 1% having twice as much wealth as the 7 billion in the world's population, and half the world's people living on less than $5.50 a day. Billionaires are increasing in number, and so is poverty at the same time. Extreme concentration between wealth and poverty, which exists in 2021 globally. And at the same time, capitalism, or the modern production system we have at the moment, does not succeed in developing social needs and what we require around the world in some sort of harmonious and steady way. It's a mess. It's a continual volatile, cyclical development of booms and slumps. And you can see in this graph of the US that while there are periods when there are quite strong periods of growth, there are also periods of serious reduction and contractions in output, employment, investment, and people's incomes. And these red spots represent a complete waste and disaster for millions of people when they take place, even if they only last for a couple of years. So we have both extremes of poverty and wealth. We also have booms and slumps in the modern economy. And as I was arguing before I got cut off, that because of the increasing move towards mechanization and technology, there's tremendous pressure on holding the wages down of ordinary workers. And as a result, labor's share in total revenues produced has been declining. You can see the right-hand panel here for the United States, a significant decline in labor's share of total revenue over the last 20 years. That means an increase in the share going to those who own the means of production and gain profits from selling commodities. And at the same time, we have this existential crisis taking place worldwide now, where such is the development of industry and urbanization, fossil fuel exploration, logging, mineral exploration, and so on, massive increase in transport using fossil fuels. We've seen a huge rise in the global average temperature, something like 1% above where it used to be in pre-industrial periods, and rising fast. This global warming is causing changes in our climate, which are seriously going to damage in droughts, famines, in floods, particularly in the poorest parts of the world. And yet very little is being done to solve this question in the modern economies. The environment is being destroyed. Rapacious expansion of industrialization looks in the search for more profits by the big multinational companies and so on, is destroying the environment, cutting down of forests in Latin America and elsewhere, the growth of pollution and environmental degradation across the world. These are major issues for the planet, leaving aside the inability of capitalism to grow in a harmonious and fair way. These are the challenges facing us in a modern society in the 21st century. But what is the explanation for this situation? How has this come about, and what can be done about it? First, let me say, some people argue, well, you know, yeah, you tell me that capitalism's a mess and it's got all these problems, but don't forget that inequality was just as bad in medieval times with the lords, the monarchs, and going even further back, if you like, slave and slavery. So what is new about inequality? You can't blame that on modern capitalism. Yes, but that inequality was a product of millions living in very primitive conditions and within other countries where the complete monopoly ownership of the land. Pauperism and unemployment was also rife in medieval times. Unemployment was high, lots of beggars and so on. Yes, again, due to the lack of ownership. But now it's lack of ownership, not in the land, but lack of ownership in the means of industry. That has become a monopoly for a few, while the many have to sell their labor power in order to live. Yes, there were lots of disasters in nature that killed millions historically. So you could argue there's nothing new in that, although the disasters we have now are going to kill way more millions than they did then. But now also, these disasters are not so much due to the fact that we can't control nature, but it's man-made. It's not due to nature. It's due to we have the scientific knowledge, we have the technology to solve many of these problems, but we do not do so for the reasons which I'm going to argue in a minute. Yes, life expectancy is much higher than it was in medieval times. So there's been a tremendous improvement in life expectancy, but that is due to the development of science, public health like sewage and water treatment and so on, and drugs and vaccines coming from scientific development. And even then, it's not worldwide. It's still not the case that people are not can expect a reasonable life expectancy in reasonable conditions in the environment that we live in the 21st century. Although scientifically and technologically, we could achieve that if we put the resources there. So what is the analysis that explains these inequalities, these disasters, this situation where millions are still in poverty, where there is the problem of unemployment on a regular basis, of a lack of living conditions and so on. Now, Marx's basic analysis of capitalism was to say, first of all, that capitalism is a system not designed to produce for what people need. It's a mode of production where things or services are produced for what we need only if there is profit for the owners of the means of production. Otherwise, these things will not be produced. So if you don't make a profit, the owners of the means of production, if they're not making a profit, they won't produce those things, whatever they are, even if socially we need them. So there is a contradiction, basic contradiction in this capitalist economy between the production of things for social need, which Marx called use values, things that we need, use, so it's valuable to us, and production for the sale and profit, which is exchange value, selling on the market, exchanging them for money, and therefore making profit. There's a contradiction between this process. Yes, all the things that are produced have a need, but not everybody can afford to buy them, and the owners of the means of production will only sell them or produce them if they can make a profit where people can afford to buy whatever there is available to charge. So we have a basic contradiction. And what happens, according to Marx, under labour, is that we have to start with the idea that only labour produces value, whether it's use value or exchange value, if I explain. So only labour works to produce things that we need and for capitalists to sell. Nobody else does it. Who is labour? That's us, people going to work on a daily, weekly, annual basis in order to either produce things or provide services. Machines don't produce value because that's only possible if workers operate those machines. If nobody's operating the machines, then there's no value produced, even if the machine is sitting there ready to go. We haven't reached the point where robots do everything yet. Perhaps we can discuss that. Capitalists do not produce value because even if they have the money, even if they have the factory, the office, the business, unless they get workers to work for them, unless they're doing it for themselves, but then that's a self-employed thing, but otherwise they have to have workers work for them. So the only value is created when workers come to work for capitalists. And as Marx put it in a short letter, every child knows a nation which ceased to work, and not say for a year, but even for a few weeks, would perish. So if everybody stopped work, a nation would perish. Every child knows too that the masses of products corresponding to different needs require different masses of total labour of society. The science of economics consists precisely in explaining how that law of value asserts itself. That's what he means by the law of value. That value is created by labour. How does that work out? How is that value created by labour produced and then appropriated by the owners of capital? So the price of anything in the law of value is determined by the amount of labour going into it. You can measure it in labour hours, or we just measure in money per hour. That's an indication of the total value produced by a society. So here's a little quote again, not many from Marx, but just a few. The product of labour is the property of the capitalist, and not that of the worker, its immediate producer. Suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's worth of labour power. Then the right to use that labour power belongs to him, just as much as the right to use any commodity, such as a horse, that he has hired for the day. So the product of this process also belongs to him, just as much as the wine, which is in the product of process of fermentation going on in his cellar. So Workers go to work, they get paid a wage, but the capitalist pays that wage, but he owns and controls everything that's being produced by the workers as a result of their work. Now, Marx outlined how important it was to distinguish between the amount that goes to workers in terms of the value in labour time and those that goes to the owners of the means of production. So if we had a working day like this, you could divide it, say, into 8 hours. So the first 4 hours of that 8 hours, the workers work, and they produce probably enough value of labour power in their wages to pay for all the goods and necessities that they need. So that will be the end of the process for them. They get their wage for 4 hours of labour, but actually they work for 8 hours in a day, and the rest of it, which is incorporated into the commodities that they've produced on behalf of the capitalist, is sold on the market, and that is a share that goes to the capitalist as surplus value, as Marx called it, unpaid labour, which is then divided up between the various capitalists, either in profits, interest, and rent. So, and if you added up the whole world's populations that working, say 3 billion, you could get the total number of hours and the number of hours divided between those that go to workers in their wages and the total hours produced, and the difference is the profit that goes to the capitalist. So that's where profit comes from. And I emphasize this for Marxist economics, because if you read mainstream economics or consider what people, nobody ever talks really about profits, except what they read in the newspapers about the profit of a big company. And it's never applied to anything going on to explain what is going on in the world economy. And the basic point of Marx's economic analysis is to explain that there is a division of what value in the world is, in each day is produced between workers' wages and what is appropriated by the capitalists in profit. And that's a key to understanding what is going on. Let me give you a little bit more of an example. Here's the process of capitalist production. M is the amount of money that a capitalist has got. C is what he does with that money in order to get production underway. P is the production process. C is what comes out of the production process, a little bit bigger than the previous C, and then that's sold on the market as M. So in capitalist production, the capitalist starts not with commodities, not with factories, he has to buy all that, but with money. And with that money, M, he then proceeds to buy the means of production, a factory, an office, computers, technology, raw materials for the production, and of course the services of workforce. So that M becomes a C, the commodities that he's purchased, including our time in order to expend on production and producing value. And then the capitalist puts the labour force to work, and they produce a new commodity which has more value than the cost of the raw materials and the labour power. So P in production becomes C, but it's a new commodity comes out which has more value. So all the workers have created more value at work than they receive in wages, and this extra surplus value goes into the boss's pocket as profit. And the capitalist sells the commodity produced in the market. Let's see, he sells it for money, and which must be more than the money he advanced at the beginning, otherwise he would not make that investment. So C must lead to a bigger M, and therefore the profit to be made in the process of the market selling on the market. So on the bottom right-hand corner, this is what we talk about in mainstream economics, selling, buying and selling things and what's happening there. But what Marxists talk about is underneath is what's going above here, the process of extra value being created and put into the hands of the bosses and controlled by them, which is missing if you're just looking at the supply and demand or exchange between money and purchases. We don't see the actual process going on to produce that result. Now, some people say, well, yeah, but that's, you say that it really depends on how many hours of work are being produced and how much is appropriated in hours or money by the capitalists. But there are lots of things out there that seem to be hugely expensive, right, relative to the amount of hours of work that's put into it. Here's an example. We have on the left here, Leonardo da Vinci picture, which in November 2017 sold for $450 million. Or one of Van Gogh's sunflowers selling for $40 million, double in price now. Now, the hours that Van Gogh took to produce that sunflower may have been 2 or 3 days. It was pretty quick. Does that, in that case, the price of that thing in value terms, in labor hour terms, ought to be tiny because there's only a few hours put in. But of course, because it's unique and original and not available, then it builds up a price of its own because of its scarcity nature. Does that prove that the idea of Marx's law of value based on how the average number of hours produced to make something is no longer correct? Well, if we think about it and think of it more in the process of general capitalist production, you can get a print of Van Gogh's picture, hundreds of thousands of print of that, and they'll cost, say, maybe £30 to purchase because the process of production becomes mass production in order to sell to a mass market. It's not an original production anymore. So when we talk about unique, original things like paintings, we're not really dealing with how capitalist production produces. We're talking really about a special collecting item, an exception to the rule of the law of value. Take, for example, a diamond necklace. A diamond necklace can be hugely expensive. Yes, there's a lot of labor hours perhaps gone into cutting the diamonds and so on, but it's still way, way more than would be the case for most necklaces. If we go into production, from mass production of necklaces, they're not going to be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. They're going to be worth 20, 40, 50, 100 pounds, whatever, because they are mass production, and that's where the main social demand is for. Only a few people can afford diamonds, and so their prices are hugely high, and there's not many of them. It's the same with Rolls Royces. Rolls Royces are extremely expensive in price terms to afford or an ordinary Ford car, but there's only a few people buying them. So those are not really the social demand for cars. Cars' average price is much, much lower and much more related to the hours worked on average to produce those cars. I present those arguments to you to present against the view that prices and values are not determined by the average hours going into producing them, but are determined by supply and demand, or by the fact that some things can be extremely expensive because they're scarce. Scarcity is not the explanation of value in society. It's an exception. It doesn't happen. Otherwise, it would. If scarcity was how it was built, we would never have any understanding of value at all. So now I want to briefly just describe 3 key things that Marx says about the capitalist economy. I call them the 3 laws of motion, the 3 laws of process taking place in capitalism. First, as I've argued, the law of value. Only labour creates value, not machines, not capitalists. It's only when we go to work do we create anything that people can use or sell. And then there's the law of accumulation. Capitalists compete against each other to get more profit. In so doing, they tend to invest more and more in technology relative to workers. So although they want to get the maximum amount of workers for the minimum wage, they find that if they use more technology, they can get the productivity of labour up and reduce labour costs. That means that even if workers are not sacked, there's less jobs available as they increase the investment in the means of production to boost the productivity of labour and hopefully the profitability for the capitalists. And then the third key law is that Marx argues the more you invest in the means of production relative to the labour employed, there will be a tendency for the overall profitability of capital to fall, because only labour creates value. And if there's more money going into machinery and technology relative to the amount going into labour, then there's a process of increased costs of mechanisation relative to the production of value from the labour force. So you get a tendency for the profitability of the overall investment that capitalists are making falling. There's a contradiction between the rising productivity of labour and the falling profitability for capital. This is a key law, and you can see it in the back of my head here, is Marx's law of profitability, is arguing that this is the essential point, that the contradiction that I talked about at the beginning between production for profit and production for social need is expressed in the fact that the capitalists face a problem. At a certain point, they can't produce enough production unless it causes a fall in profitability. And that brings them to bring about the end of investment and production and enter a period of slump. This contradiction between what society needs and falling profitability over time is only reconciled periodically by recurring crises of production and investment. In the long term, you'll only be reconciled by getting rid of this capitalist mode of production. And in the process of this continual slumps and booms, what happens is that the weak capitalists get wiped out and the stronger capitalists replace them, and we get increasing concentration and centralization of the ownership of the means of production globally. And here's a measure by the Swiss Institute of Technology. They looked at all the holding companies and how they were connected together around the world, and they found that there's just about 150 companies who own all the other companies, or at least a section of them, and control 40% of the world's corporate assets. And there's about 1,300 companies who own through their shares the majority of all the other companies, the real economy, blue chip manufacturing firms, representing 80% of global revenue. So you can see if you a huge concentration. We did a little map here, which you see was the bits of these companies in the middle are controlling all these little ones on the outside. That's the way in which modern capitalism works, through these highly concentrated and centralized companies, the big banks, the big oil companies, the big tech companies now that are now in the middle here, while the myriads of smaller companies are connected or linked to them in other ways. And in fact, we can see most of the profits that are being produced by these companies or reported is in these very, very big tech companies, the FANGs we call them, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. These big 5 American tech media companies, you can see on the right, are making huge profits. The percentage of their total profits, just these 5 companies, has dramatically increased to something like 20% of total profits. And all the other companies in the US, and this is the other tech companies, but all the other companies outside the big 5 and the other tech companies are hardly making any profit at all. So when you read in the paper about huge profits going to Jeff Bezos at Amazon or Zuckerberg at Facebook and so on, remember that actually that's not the situation for the vast swathe of capitalist companies around the world. And here's a measure over the last 150 years of Marx's law of profitability, whether that law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall has actually been operating. And you can see that if you go back to the last part of the 19th century, it was up around 45% on this measure, and we had a long period of downturn. But there are also periods when there's a recovery, usually in wars, when lots of companies are wiped out, there's destruction, new technologies applied, and the capitalism can get a bit of a boost for a while. But then this tendency for the profitability continues to play roles, and you get into the Great Depression of the 1930s, a big drop, then another war to drive it up. And in the period when I was young, like some of you I can see on screen, in the golden age, there was quite a high level of profitability relative for a period of time. We had an expansion of welfare services, of public sector, education and health and so on, when profits were relatively high. And then we had the terrible period from the 1970s to the early 80s of a severe drop in profitability and the reversal of the policies that we had in the post-war period, and the beginning was so-called the neoliberal period, where desperately the capitalists tried to drive up their profits at the expense of workers, public sector privatizations, trade union destruction and so on. And now we're still in a period of very low profitability. So Marx's law is being applied again. So when we look at the situation now, the law of profitability tells us that capitalism is still in pretty dire straits at the moment, and it's not easily resolved without possibly a major development. And we can see the contradiction which has developed in the recent period by looking at these 2 graphs. On the left, this is the situation when we've come into COVID now. We can see that capitalism, the blue line, is the advanced capitalist economy's growth rates, was slowing down before COVID began. It was almost down to 0 or hardly above. It was not doing very well. And then we entered the year of the COVID 2020, when everything was closed down and it's dramatically fallen. The same applies to the so-called emerging economies, which are the pink ones here as well. And then if we look at the right-hand side, which is the development of the stock market, very useful resource, doesn't do anything to help social need in any way. We can see a dramatic rise, particularly during the year of the COVID, to new heights. So we have the contradiction in modern capitalism between the failure to produce things for social need and the collapse there on the left, and the rise of what Marx called fictitious capital and stock market speculation, financial speculation for profits in the stock market. That's what we've come to in 2021. And now, just to summarize in the year of the COVID, the argument is that coronavirus and other viruses have been a product coming out of nature, coming out of the blue, not expected, nothing to do with what's happening in capitalism worldwide. And yet we now know the evidence is clear that coronavirus and other viruses are coming from pathogens that have been in thousands of years in remote parts of the world in wildlife, bats and other animals. And that has spread because of the expansion of fossil fuel exploration, mineral exploration, urbanization, industrial farming. Those pathogens in wildlife who are immune to it, that's jumped across to farmed animals, particularly industrial farmed animals, and then into the food markets of humanity, and then into us. And that this is a process, the result of the herbaceous expansion of capitalism, not any other reason that we could see. And there are a number of ecologists, social ecologists have spelled out how that has happened over the past period. But it's not only that, these dangerous diseases are coming from new pathogens, could well have been dealt with, but there was no preparation, no attempt to use resources to protect us from these dangerous pathogens which are developing, which were well known. In fact, it's now known that of the 18 largest pharmaceutical companies in the US, 15 did no work on antivirals, antibiotics, or tropical killer diseases. They spent all their resources and scientists and technology on heart medicines, tranquilizers, and so on, which are profitable. We could have had a universal vaccine for influenza now. We have a pretty ineffective one, which you have to change every year, but it was never deemed profitable enough to make that a priority and meet social need, because there was no profit in it. So the contradiction between profit and social need has been expressed in this COVID pandemic and in previous ones before, and will be in the next one. Yes, science finally got its act together, was allowed to get its act together with resources pumped in over the last year to deliver so amazingly quickly in a short period of time a series of vaccines which we hope will immunize us against this current pandemic. But nothing was done beforehand in preparation to deal with this danger which existed for humanity as a whole, and it was allowed to happen. And of course, even when it arrived, the medical systems and the health systems of the world were in no position to protect us, because they've been cut and slashed and reduced, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years. Privatization, reduction in health resources, in nurses and doctors and so on. And if you want to measure it by hospital beds per thousand, which I do here, we can see the countries that have done best in avoiding and reducing the number of deaths from COVID-19, Japan, Korea, Germany, are the ones with the highest hospital beds per thousand. China, which has done very best, is right down here. I'm coming to the end. And right over here, you can see the UK and Sweden, where we are right down the bottom. Finally, Meg, what Marx's theory doesn't say, let's just analyze capitalism. The point is to change it. And in my view, that means replacing capitalism with a global plan for full employment. It means public investment in infrastructure. It means investment in harmony with the natural world. The fossil fuel industry has got to be phased out. It means cancelling the debts for the poorest countries, ending the tax havens for the rich, taxing the rich properly, and above all, bringing into public ownership the major financials and multinationals of the world can be organized for social objectives on a democratic basis and not for the profit of a few owners of capital.